Good evening. Welcome to this wonderful evening. It's the third time Rick Santos has been with us in this sanctuary. Preached here, did a teach-in, and again tonight. We're so glad to see you back. And Frank, so thank you for your leadership with Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. We always have to give you the welcome. I'm Pastor Mark Knutson, pastor of Augustana. We declared ourselves a sanctuary church back in 1996, our first year here. And I want to acknowledge Francisco Aguirre, who lived here for 81 days. Francisco, rise up, please. Francisco still does not have status. We took on the federal government, ICE, and everybody else. But he is on staff here, runs a nonprofit called Viva, about a $200,000 budget now, and is on staff also pastorally. And so we give thanks for what you bring to this city, Francisco. So welcome to Augustana. Here's our welcome. We always say, welcome to Augustana. We're a thriving, multicultural, multinational, multi-generational congregation, called by Christ as Christians to work closely more than ever today with our Native American spiritual colleagues, Muslim, Jew, Hindu, Buddhist, Sikh, other people of faith and people of just goodwill, to weave the beloved community where justice and peace kiss, where everybody can have a home and be welcome. We're all welcomed and affirmed for who we were created to be. That's our age, our ethnicity, our human sexuality, our gender expansiveness. Let me just keep going across the list. Where we were born, that is pure gift to this community, pure gift to this country we live in, and pure gift to the world. Turn to your neighbor and say, you're created in the image of God. And turn to somebody else and say, you know this, aren't you beautiful? And it's in that spirit we gather tonight. We want to see a day when we renew the earth for generations to come. We're a solar sanctuary church, which means anybody seeking refuge, especially from other places, a home can come here and live if they need to, and we've done that. And we're a solar church, which means we are totally solar now, but we're totally greening the church. And as Ecumenical Ministries knows and Church World Services, you always need a micro example to create the macro. You have to go to Dexter Avenue Baptist to get a sense of how civil rights can unfold across the country. So our goal is to have this two-building complex totally green, and then become a kind of a prototype of how we take old brick buildings, which people would never imagine could be green. And if we could do that in every synagogue, temple, mosque, longhouse in this country, we'll turn everything in different directions. I've only got 2 minutes, so I'm going to finish up. We all know the great work of Church World Services. I was in Washington, D.C. I was telling, this is going live, so I got to be careful what I say. This is being recorded too, so you can go back and get this on the webpage and show it to others. But I was back in Washington, D.C. I had the honor of being welcomed back by Senator Merkley for the State of the Union by President Biden. And there was a gathering ahead of time of the 100 senators and their 100 guests, and I worked that room as much as I could, Republicans and Democrats. But in that room, you could tell those who were speaking with great integrity, whose hearts are going out right now. And they were in agreement, many, that we as people of faith need to change the narrative on immigration in this country. It's shifted way too far, where suddenly one party's creating a context where the other one's kind of trying to meet them somewhere, but that's not where we are as Christians. We know what we need to be about in this nation. There's room for everybody, and it's pure gift to this community. And so, Church World Services, thank you for all you do. We are thrilled to have you here tonight. And Frank, so with Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, we're all been part of this for years. And Emo, I could drop Emo's name all over D.C. Almost every senator says, oh, we know Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. We know Church World. Of course, know Church World Services. And the energy around people of faith active in the public square is so important today. So Reverend Beverly Jackson, Chair of Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon, please come up and offer an opening prayer. You know you're not going to come in this church and not preach or teach or pray, my dear friend. We are so honored to have so many former presidents of EMO here. I'm looking around the room, and so many board members and so many others. I see a 6th grader back there. Well, you'll be going to the State of the Union next year, I'm sure. I do have to drop a name. I did have next to me the senator from West Virginia. Well, thank you, Manchin, because we have mutual friends. His wife was next to me. We were right on the balcony looking right at the president during the State of the Union. and right above where they entered, so I could look down at all the Supreme Court justices entering. But the other person next to me, and many of you will know who this is, Billie Jean King, a legend in terms of women's rights, tennis, and all the rest, human sexuality. And she's going to come to Portland. I gave her the address, and she'll be here. Reverend Jackson, please offer an invocation. And welcome. Know you're home when you're here. And we just love working ecumenically and interfaith. We have to do this more than ever right now, given the context of the world we live in. Please.
Well, I have to thank Mark for calling my name. And I'm not technically the president until I think it's 14 more days. It's a few more days. And Julia Spence, who is the current chair, is in the room. Amen? So let us pray. Most gracious and precious Lord, we thank you for allowing us to gather, God, and we're asking that you be in the midst of this gathering, those who are concerned about one another, about our fellow man, about our humans, God, that we can do something that makes a difference in this world, that someone may not go homeless, that someone may not go hungry, that someone may not be crying tonight because they don't know where they can turn. Because God, this is a world that cares. And this group, this body of believers that showed up on this rainy evening in Portland, Oregon, we believe that we can make a difference if we work together. So be with us, work through us, and use us for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Julia Spence, please rise up, chair of the board, who's a wonderful leader. As Frank So comes up, Julia, I want you to know I've got a $1,000 check. I think we pledged at the banquet a while back, and I never got it since, so here's a $1,000 check. It's for immigration and administration.
Thank you, Mark, thank you. What a good example, huh? Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. It's really wonderful to have so many friends, new friends, folks that we know, folks that we don't know coming today because you're interested in some of the same things that matter to us. It's our values. Thank you to Pastor Mark. Thank you to Andy, to the whole crew here, Francisco, Marilyn, for coming here to be part of that joy of music that we're going to have tonight. I'd also like to say thank you to our staff who've put this together. Emo does not exist without such talented, yes, people. If you've heard anything from me about Emo, it's that what we do matters. Let me repeat that again. What we do matters. And the we is not just the staff. The we is our partnerships, it's our friends like John Calhoun, who's here, our friends like Maria Waters, who's here, all of our friends, not just the core Emo staff. And let me just give you a quick recount. In 2023, at the Northeast Emergency Food Pantry, Emo distributed 2.2 million tons of food, over 120,000 meals for those living with HIV/AIDS. We've ensured unaccompanied houseless students received over 3,600 days of housing. We've counseled, sheltered, and cared for 53 survivors of domestic violence. We've resettled over 240 refugees in 2023. Vesna probably will tell me the exact number. We've provided over 2,500 consultations for low-income immigrants and refugees. Caroline, who's here, will probably also give me a better number tonight. But what's important is why we're here and why we do the work that we do, not just the numbers. Let me tell you what you'll expect to hear tonight. You'll be hearing from my good friend, the CEO and president of CWS, Rick Santos. We'll have a great moment of reflection by Francisco. Rick will take some of your questions. I think Marilyn will be singing a song for us to bring our spirits up, and then we'll be wrapping it up. So let me again say, as Emo celebrates its 50th year, and a preview that we are also looking to expand our refugee resettlement program, that we're happy to have you here. So thank you very much. And let me introduce now Rick Santos. Rick has served and is serving not only as president and CEO of Church World Service, but Rick has also been president of IMA World Health, which some of you, especially if you're Lutheran, you know it as Lutheran World Relief. Yes, correct. He's served abroad in countries like Vietnam. He still travels a lot abroad. We were just talking about that over dinner. But he understands the roots of poverty, the roots of conflict, and the refugee situation probably better than anyone else that I know. So it's an honor to welcome Rick Santos. Rick, thank you for being here.
Good evening, everyone, and I'm glad you found time on a rainy, cold evening to come and listen to me for hopefully not too long. I'm very excited to be here with you tonight, and really happy that and Frank and Mark really a joy to be here in your church. Next slide, please. Got a lot to talk about, so I'm going to go through it really quickly. Some of it's going to be context, and then we're going to really talk about some of the issues around resettlement and migration. Next slide. So just a little bit about me. I've been doing this work for over 30 years. I got my start as a mission volunteer with the Presbyterian Church USA in Thailand. I was a volunteer teacher at a place called Bangkok Christian College, and worked, and at that time, that was the late 80s, so that will date me, and I was, as I was a volunteer teacher in the late 80s, there were refugees from Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia in Thailand. There was, during that time, Aung San Suu Kyi was elected for the first time as president of Burma, then renamed Myanmar, and she was imprisoned, and then 125,000 Burmese, mostly Hill tribe refugees crossed the border into Thailand. So as a person who with a lot of curiosity, I was able to really understand that context, learn a lot, made a lot of friends, people who went to my church. I got to learn from them, and really that set me on this trajectory. And so much of my career has been with CWS. This is my second time with the organization, a decade living and working in Southeast Asia, and really just trying to make a difference in the lives of everyday people. So what brings me to Portland? Rodney and Sandy Page, of course. Is this okay? No, making sure it's not too loud. So Rodney and Sandy Page, who are my dear, dear friends. Rodney, as you know, connects me to the ecumenical ministries, but also Rodney was my boss and my mentor and my friend at Church World Service. He unfortunately is not feeling well tonight, so was not able to join us, though I know he will watch this when we send him the video. But also, you know, I wanted to come here. I was invited by Frank to really talk about, I think, the partnership between Church World Service and Ecumenical Ministries, and really a really decades-long partnership on several different things, including not just refugees, but on hunger issues as well. Next slide. So just a little about Church World Service. So I don't know if people know Church World Service. This is our vision statement. It's one that I really like. I like, and we'll have a mission statement up there in a minute, but a vision where everyone has food, voice, and a safe place to call home. And I think, you know, as I go through this conversation or this talk tonight, you know, I think one of the questions that always plagues me is, why do people leave their home? And I think we're going to try to explore that a little bit tonight. So Church World Service, we are 78 years old. We were founded by 17 mainline Protestant churches, maybe progressive Protestant churches, in 1946. And we were basically created to help rebuild Europe and Japan and Asia after World War II. We've been through every decade of our life as an organization has been slightly different. We were part of the National Council of Churches for many years, and then since 2000, we've been our own organization and agency. But just to say that Church World Service has been working with refugees, we've been addressing emergency response, and doing development work for this entire time. Next slide. So this is our mission statement, and I think I like the word transforming communities. I think that's always one of the things that we try to talk about, but also just and sustainable responses to hunger, poverty, displacement, and disaster. This is, again, what we've been doing for 78 years. So just to say, one of the things I'm most proud of in the work that we do at Church World Service globally, both here in the US and globally, is, and what drives me every day is trying to make sure we have what I call mission impact. We're a mission-driven organization. We are a 401c3, which is what nonprofits are usually called here in the US. But frankly, what keeps me up at night is thinking about how we can do more. And just there's some figures, I don't want to read through all of them, but just in the different areas that we do, the number of people we've impacted over the last year. And just a little, this is a footprint of where we work globally and in the US. And it's interesting, the yellow is where we actually have direct presence, we have offices, and the gray is where we reach. Next slide. One of the things I think is really important about Church World Service is that we've always been a partner organization. We work with local partners across the globe. We work with local partners here in the US, whether they be local food banks or whether they be groups like Ecumenical Ministries. And that's one of the strengths of Church World Service and the way we work. And frankly, it's one of the things I'm really most proud of. In our community, in the international relief and development community, one of the things that they're talking about now as if it's a new thing, they're calling it the localization of aid. And so they're trying to work through local organizations to say we can be more effective in the way we deliver the aid across the globe. And I kind of always have to smile when I hear these conversations because we've been doing it for over 40 years. Many of our churches have had a missiology called accompaniment, which is to really work with local partners where they are. In the kind of the rough and tumble world of aid development and a lot of resources going, they call them subcontractors, but we never have. They've always been partners. And when I was in Thailand, one of the first lessons I learned was the Thai church was basically there were a lot of churches that built had missionaries for 100 years there. They built the churches, they built 36 schools, and they built about a dozen hospitals. When I was there in the late 80s, all of those institutions were run by local Thai leadership. So we've been localizing for decades, and I think it's important to have that conversation. So I lift this slide up because I think that's just one of the things we should be proud of, not just as Church World Service, but for many of the churches that have had mission work for over 100 years. Next slide. So tonight, wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the conversation around migration. Next slide, please. Next slide. So, one of the challenges in this area is that having a common set of definitions of what we're talking about. So we talk about refugees, and a lot of people use the term refugees to mean a lot of different things. But in the work that we do, a lot of these terms actually have legal meaning, and they actually have, in order to be able to address them, we have to understand how they're actually fully defined. So really the largest basket, when we talk often, we talk about migration and migrants. And migration and migrants can take a lot of different forms. So one form is what we call asylum seekers. So we hear a lot about that here in the US because of people who are coming over the southern border and people who are applying for asylum. But I like this quote, I don't know if you can read it here in yellow, I'll just say it out loud. Not all asylum seekers will be found to be refugees, but all refugees were once asylum seekers. So people who come across the southern border are asking for asylum, and that's definitely one category of people that we interact with. Next slide. The second is refugees. So how do we define refugees? Well, refugees are defined by the 1951 Refugee Convention. UNHCR basically defines the refugee as really somebody who is leaving their home, right? And the big difference is they're leaving their home and they're crossing an international border. So if you're going from one country to another, you are technically a refugee. Usually there's also other pieces related to that. You're fleeing, you're in fear of your life, you're in fear of your family's life, you've been forced out. There's a lot of things that define it, but the biggest the definition is crossing an international border. Next slide. The reason why I say that is because the other category of people that are migrants that are fleeing their homes because of fear of their lives, because of maybe an earthquake, whatever caused them to leave, but they don't cross an international border, are not considered refugees. They're considered IDPs, or internally displaced people. So with all of those, next slide. One last thing. So, thank you. Let's see if I can get it the right way. I just wanted to talk about root causes. So these are the definitions of the different categories of people, but I want to talk a little bit about root causes. And we break them up into two areas. One is we call triggers, and these are shorter term things, like when there is for example, last year there's that massive earthquake in Turkey and Syria, right? And many people were displaced from their homes, and some people crossed a border, some people moved to, like in Turkey, moved to other parts of Turkey. But many things like specific violence, an attack, a specific war, all of these things will trigger movement. The other side of this is drivers. So besides the specific triggers of people moving from one place to another, people leaving their homes, is what are the long-term drivers of migration globally? And it's much of the same thing. And I'm just going to read really quickly. Underlying drivers of displacement: poverty and inequity, fragile and weak governance, rapid urbanization, climate change, and environmental degradation. And we're seeing that last one more and more, and we'll have some facts on that. But I want you to look at the second one: fragile and weak governance. And we'll take a look at the next slide. So just to give you here's the so we talked about the definitions, we talked about some of the root causes. Here are the numbers. And these I hope are as shocking to you as they are to me. In the last year or so, they've basically identified 110 million people who've left their homes. So, and if you notice, they break it down into different categories. 36.4 are refugees, people who have crossed an international border. 62, almost double, are people who are displaced within their own country. When I started a church world service about 3 years ago, that number was about 70 million. So in a very short amount of time, and actually maybe a decade prior to that, the number was pretty stable, if you could say that, at around 50 million. That over really the last decade, the number has increased pretty dramatically. Again, now remember in the definition of, or one of the drivers where it said political instability, over here is a kind of a statistic that I think is very interesting. 52% of refugees come from 3 countries. Look at the 3 countries. What do these countries have in common? Significant political instability. So a lot of the migration, a lot of the refugee movements, a lot of IDP movement are fueled because of political instability and war. Yeah, so the 3 countries are the Syrian, so they originate from Syria, Afghanistan, and Ukraine. And then the other piece is the Islamic Republic. So the other thing we're going to talk about is that for most refugees, the burden of refugees actually falls oftentimes on the country that's right next door. So when I was just sharing my experience, I lived in Thailand in the late 80s. Thailand is bordered by Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Myanmar. So Thailand at that time actually was probably one of the countries that held the most refugees in the world at that one point in time. Iran, Turkey, Germany, because of the Ukraine, Colombia, and Pakistan. And Colombia is because of all the refugees that now are coming out of Venezuela. So talk a little bit more about the scale of the problem, which I think will be helpful, because as we talk about what goes on in the US and some of the solutions, 75% of all refugees are hosted by low and middle income countries. I think, and then 69% hosting in neighboring countries. So what does that say? What does that say about the scope of the problem in those local contexts? So if there's 110 million people on the move, or 36 refugees, and 75% are going into neighboring countries, and those countries are low and middle income countries, think about the burden of those populations on those countries. Now, there is some international support, but the scale and scope of what those countries have to deal with is pretty staggering. So, sorry, I'm running through this. Like, we could have a whole talk on each one of these, so I'm sorry that we're covering a lot of ground and there's a lot to absorb. But in the world of refugee resettlement, we talk about durable solutions. So now you can go to a UNHCR meeting and you can talk about the 3 durable solutions, and this is what they talk about. I'm gonna start at the bottom. So I don't know if you can read the bottom piece, but it says fewer than 1% of refugees will actually be resettled to a third country. So if those 36 million people that are refugees, less than 1% will actually be able to avail themselves of that third durable solution, refugee resettlement. So what's the best solution? I think for years people have really talked about really the best solution is if refugees, and I think you've talked to many people who have left their home, if they could go back, if they felt it was safe, they would go back. Yet, and so a lot of, historically, a lot of people have gone back. And in fact, there was a period of time when things become stable. I'll give you a perfect example. Actually, I lived and worked in South Sudan for a period of time. And in South Sudan, there were 2 sets of civil wars. There was the first civil war between the South and the North, where South Sudan became independent. And there was a lot of refugees that fled the violence and the fighting. When they had a peace accord, when South Sudan became its own separate country, many of those refugees went back into South Sudan. So that's clear. That is an opportunity. Of course, then a year and a half later, there was another civil war within South Sudan itself, and it created another wave of refugees. But the idea is, I think the best durable solution is for voluntary return, as long as it's safe. And the last version of the durable solution is local integration. But I think the local integration opportunity, or option, I should say, is a really hard one, because most of the countries where people are in big camps are countries that are poor and middle income and unable to basically integrate the refugees into their countries. So what you often have are these very large refugee camps that are there for decades. So I was just actually visiting Kakuma refugee camp in northern Kenya. So Kakuma gets a lot of different types of refugees. They get actually refugees from South Sudan. They get some from the DR Congo. They get some from Somalia and other places. So when we drove into the camp, there was Camp 1, there was Section 1, Section 2, Section 3, Section 4. Section 1 was the original camp. And those people, many of those people had been in that camp for over 20 years. You have a whole generation of people who were born and live in these camps. And people kept on coming, and they just had to continue to expand. It was just a heartbreaking listen to some of the stories of people in the camp. So, okay, so I don't mean to depress you tonight. And so what can we do about it? And so how do we address refugees here in the United States? So if that's the scope of the problem, that's some of the statistics, the global statistics, what do we do? So frankly, here in the US, we do give money to UNHCR, we support camps, we help with those other durable solutions, but the one I think that relates to us most directly through church world service and as the ecumenical ministries is actually the resettlement. So how did I think people need to understand also a little bit of the context and the history in the United States. So prior to 1980, people would come in, there were processes for accepting refugees, but there was no comprehensive way to receive and to really think about and process refugees. So with the Refugee Act of 1980, that set into motion a lot of the laws, and basically that's the laws that govern the way that we resettle refugees today. So we call it the USRAP. The U.S. Refugee Admissions Program is the program that brings refugees into the U.S. Every year, so there's certain elements to this, and every year there's something called, I'm giving you all our acronyms, the PD, the Presidential Determination. So every year, by law, the president determines how many people will come into the country. So it's a formal process. The president makes the decree, and then then the government tries to resettle that many refugees into the U.S. In the previous administration, the refugee numbers went down to the last year of the previous administration to 15,000 people. That was the lowest number in over almost since the 1980 Act was signed. The current administration said we are going to go back and we have a commitment to refugees and to resettlement. This is an important part of who we are, our values as a country. And so the PD this year is 125,000 refugees. 2 years ago it was 60, and we didn't actually meet that number. So part of the issue is the organizations that do refugee resettlement by and large are groups like Church World Service and Ecumenical Ministries. We're nonprofit agencies. We are not for-profit agencies. We don't have a lot of extra money laying around. And when the previous administration was reducing the numbers, it got to the point where essentially the entire refugee resettlement infrastructure was at risk of collapsing. And luckily, progressive states like Portland, they actually put state money to support the refugee resettlement. Other states did the same, but frankly, for the most part, those numbers were really low. So over the last 3 years, we have been, as a community, a refugee resettlement community, we've been trying to rebuild that pipeline and to be able to create the context to resettle more refugees. Whether we'll get to 125, I think we will, but there's a lot of challenges with that number today. And just a few other things, there are 10 official resettlement agencies that are recognized by the United States Department of State, which is the agency that manages refugee resettlement. And we are one of 10. We are, I would say we are probably one of the, I would say the top 4 in terms of size, though the ones who are the top 2 are really quite much bigger than us. And then just to say that, the refugee resettlement process, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how a refugee comes to the U.S., but frankly, there's different statuses of types of people who come in. So there's different legal statuses. So refugee is actually a legal status in the U.S. There's other types of visas. There's the SIV holders. So we saw a lot of this with the Afghans that came in with the fall of Kabul, and then all of a sudden there was 100,000 Afghans trying to come into the country, and since they did not go through the resettlement process, the refugee process, that they actually were given this special status. And then humanitarian parolees. So SIVs actually went to many folks who worked for our government and worked for their military And then the humanitarian parole were some Ukrainians who've come in, got a humanitarian parole, as well as Afghans. So what does it take to come into the U.S. as a refugee? And, you know, the interesting thing is I know there's a lot of narratives around about newcomers, and so that's another way that a better way, I think, of describing people who come into this country as newcomers. But people who do go through the refugee process are some of the most vetted people in the world. So they're initially identified by UNHCR. So UNHCR goes into all these camps. They literally listen to every story. They create files on people, and then they help pre-select people who are eligible for resettlement. Then we actually, as Church World Service, also work on the other side. We are in Africa. We are one of the processing units. The government has about 8 of them across the globe. We have the contract for the one in Africa. And so the RSC is actually the one that we run. And so we, as one of the RSCs, go and then we validate those stories. We actually get more information. We actually vet them a second time. And then finally, the U.S. Agency that basically reviews all the refugee files and makes the final determination about who will get resettled. So there is nobody more vetted in terms of, you know, in the narratives of security and all this than refugees, frankly. And then if once they're approved for resettlement, then they go through IOM to get some health check. They have cultural orientation. They travel to the U.S. By then, we'll have decided whether they will come to CWS or one of the other agencies, and then CWS will talk to our affiliate network or our own offices, and then we'll figure out where we would place them, and then we place them. I just want people to understand it's a much more complicated process. People aren't just coming over, right? This is even the Afghans were vetted not as thoroughly as this because it was a quicker time frame, but there was a tremendous amount of vetting of people who come to this country. We at CWS, of the total, we resettle between 10 and 15% of all refugees that come to the U.S. And there was a map. I wanted to show you the map first. We resettle through both our own offices and our affiliate network. And so Ecumenical Ministries is one of our affiliates. We're actually a funny organization that way. Usually organizations either resettle them themselves completely, or they use an affiliate network completely. So we're one of the few hybrids where we do both. Let me just go back. Okay. Just some more data, but I'm going to just go into this. So what happens when a refugee comes? Actually, Vesna could probably tell you better than anybody in this room what happens when a refugee comes. But usually, I was really fortunate to go to Winchester, Virginia. We are opening an office, a resettlement office there for Church World Service. We already had one in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And we were just opening a brand new resettlement office. And I got to go in and meet essentially the committee of people who were starting that office. And frankly, it looked much like the group that's in this church tonight. It was somebody from the Lutheran Church, somebody from the Presbyterian Church, somebody from the Episcopal Church, somebody from the Methodist Church. It was basically a committee of people from those churches who are helping us figure out how we're going to set up that office in Winchester. And so one person was in charge of healthcare. So when a family comes, they make sure they get into the healthcare system. One person was in charge of education, and they helped make sure that the kids got enrolled into schools. One person was in charge of housing. That is one of the biggest challenges right now for people, newcomers coming into the United States. One person was in charge of employment. And I told this story just a little bit earlier this evening, but I want to tell it again. It was just fascinating to me to hear when I was talking to the person who was in charge of employment, what are you doing? Who are you talking to? And so they're talking to local businesses, but he said he went out, just outside of Winchester is a Rubbermaid factory. And he went to the manager of that factory and he said, hey, we're going to be resettling some Afghan refugees, and we'd like to bring them and see if there's jobs for them. And the manager of the factory said, I will take every person you bring. That there was not enough employment in that area, and so they were looking for people to help. So it was really shocking to me that just how quickly, frankly, refugees usually have about 3 months of support from the US government and from these agencies like us. Oftentimes we extend that through building relationships with local church and other community networks. And so what we try to do is try to create as much support for families when they come in as we can. And then, but for the most part, people are employed, they get employment almost immediately. So again, there's other narratives out there about newcomers can come in and, they're living off the system. Frankly, that's just not true. So just want to introduce one other little piece here, and then we have a few more slides. But so about 2 years ago, the private sector, especially when the Afghans were coming in, and basically, most resettlement is done through those 10 resettlement agencies, of which Church World Service is one, national agencies. And a lot of the private sector, so people from like Accenture and from Airbnb and all these big companies came together and they said, well, can we try to create another pathway to help resettle, to take the burden off those 10 groups? And so they created something called, with the government and with groups like Church World Service, the Welcome Corps. And so the Welcome Corps, and you can go online, it's called welcome.org. And so they basically said, other countries use a different method. They don't go through a national, let's say, like the State Department. They use Canada as an example. Canada has community resettlement. And frankly, that's actually how we in the US used to do it prior to the Refugee Act and right after World War II. We would resettle people through communities and churches. And so they created a secondary pathway called, through the Welcome Corps. And so we've been supporting that. We think it's a good idea. We think that if there's multiple pathways for people to be resettled, we think that's a good idea. So this is probably the little bit more. So so one whole area is refugee and refugee resettlement, and I think we talked a lot about that. I just want to talk a little bit about the border. I know the southern border is and Mark was very eloquent in his remarks and his introduction today about the southern border. There's an interesting statistic. If you go to Pew Charitable Trust, they've actually, there's several reports of people who are undocumented who come into this country, and what's the number and what's the scale of the issue. And the last data they had was from 2021, and they said there was approximately 10 million people undocumented in the US. And they said actually the number had peaked a few years earlier at around 12 to 13 and actually had come down. And of that 10 million, many of the people who were undocumented had been here for many, many years. So at least a decade, if not longer. So again, I think there's a narrative that if you now put that into context of all that we said about refugees and bordering countries and the burden of a middle and low income country receiving people who come across their border, and then you think about actually the scale of the problem for the wealthiest nation in the world, it puts it a little bit into a different perspective. Just a couple of things. Many of the folks coming to the US through the southern border, originally the biggest groups were from Mexico and from they call the Northern Triangle, which is El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. But actually, that number has gotten less as a percentage of the total, and you see a lot more people coming from Venezuela and other parts of the world. Church World Service for decades had not been involved with any of the work on the southern border, but we did decide, the board of directors decided a few years back that we wanted to expand. We felt there was a very allied approach to the work that we did with refugees, and so we are implementing a program that's part of the Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement called Home, Study, and Post-Release Services. So we work actually with children who come across the border who are unaccompanied. And so we try to create once they're released from ICE, then they are, it's not, I mean, there's so many, we only have a certain fraction of the cases. We try to make sure that they get to a place that's safe. Oftentimes they have a relative or somebody they know, and then we try to do follow-up just to make sure they're okay and help them with other services as they await, their processing. I'm not going to make a comment of, it's because in another slide I talk about us being a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. But I will say that I think it's really important that we have clarity on the border. We have debates within our own organization about what the best policy is. I think everyone was actually, we think that the deal that was in front of the president, or never made it to the president, but that had been discussed, the bipartisan deal, would have done a lot to help define the border. One of the things I want to say too is historically, and I'll say this a little bit later as well, all these issues, refugee issues, were a completely bipartisan issue. Every president has set up, whether they're Republican or Democrat, had supported refugee resettlement, at least since the 1980 Act, but even before that. And so, for us, it's really important that we'd love it to go back to being a kind of a nonpartisan issue. So I'm going to wrap this up. I know this has been long, and thank you so much for bearing with me, and I hope this has been helpful. But I think one of the questions always is, we talked about the durable solutions, but what can we do? And I think there's a lot of things we can do as a community. One of the things we can do is support your local organization, and here it's the SOAR and Ecumenical Ministries. There's a lot of different, they are looking to expand their work and bring in more people, and we support that, but that takes resources, that takes money to build out a new place to resettle and so forth. So one of the things that's really important is that you support your local agencies. The other one is housing. That's the biggest, if you ask me, the biggest single constraint now for refugee resettlement today, it's actually finding housing. So in a lot of the urban markets, the housing is really tight. It's really expensive, and that, I would say, as we're looking to resettle 125,000 refugees this year, this is the biggest challenge. So any support you can give, any thoughts, actually one of the companies that's been so helpful actually over the last few years has been Airbnb. They've given us over $1 million worth of essentially housing credits to help do temporary placements of refugees as we look for longer term solutions to their housing. But really, if you have any ideas, if you have resources, let Frank know, let me know. I mean, we're always looking for housing. As I mentioned earlier, we are a 501c3, we're a nonpartisan organization, but we are passionate about what we believe in and about our values, and we advocate for those. And I'll just leave it at that. And then, as we think about the future and as we think about possible changes, we're worried about all of these things. And I'm sure you all are too. Thank you. Yeah, we'll take a break. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to sing a song that I don't know if I remember of the word. Oh, but God is good. it, it, it prepared the stage for me in case I forget the word. How many of you won't understand? And I'll, yay, Francisco did a good job. Right at the sanctuary, September 14th, the day that ICE tried to detain me, surround my house with the local police, sheriff, tried to take me in custody, but Agustana, since then, it's been my house. And because of community stand up supporting my family and I'm here. But let me tell you that who paid all the consequences, my son Moses, who got killed back in El Salvador. He was with me by the time that ICE tried to take me in custody, and he was afraid because after everything, it was quiet, believing the ICE will give me the chance to apply for my asylum. That's when many politicians that you see working for the government, they went after me and they ordered many investigations against me, and my son was afraid and he decided to go back only to get killed. That's the reality in El Salvador, even though that many believe that El Salvador it's safe for us now. But I wanna sing a song, and the name of the song is called Jacinto Zenobio. Many Indians community who don't speak Spanish left their small village, go to a big city where it's hard for them to keep up, to really make up their living and make enough to sustain their family. As many of us as migrants, we come to this country with many barriers. Many don't make it. I always like to remember the memory of Santos, a good friend who we met in the street under the bridge. We did not have a place to live. He got trapped in the system. He started consuming alcohol, drugs, and he was afraid to tell his family that he did not have money to send back home. En la capital lo hay en un mercado, consume capaz, descargando un carro. Le dije, padrino, lo andaba buscando, se echó un trago de vino y se quedó pensando. Me dijo, ahijado, un favor le pido, que a Naiden le cuente que me ha encontrado, que yo ya no quiero volver para allá, si lo que más quiero nada es igual. Perdí la cosecha, mi dignidad, si lo que más quiero nada es igual, cobija y sombrero queme el jacal. Si en mi paraíso nada es igual. Le dije, padrino, lo he andado buscando. Él se echó un suspiro
se quedó pensando. Jacinto Zenobio, Jacinto Adán, si en tu paraíso solo había paz, yo no sé qué culpa quieres pagar ahí en el infierno de esta nación. We still trap. I see the border there, and I remember when the authorities told me that they will let me continue with my case, but I have to keep quiet and say anything. And everybody told me, don't worry, we will say it, you know. But I believe I have freedom, and I can say that walls and racist immigration laws are not welcome nowhere. And if you ask me where I am from, I believe I born in El Salvador, but I'm from United States of America because that's where I'm standing right now. I love you all.
We'll now take some questions from folks here for Rick. Please make your comments as concise as, or your questions as concise as possible. And yes, and we'll have a mic to pass around. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand and we will pass it around to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, is this working? Hello? There we go. Okay.
All right.
Just needed to be a little patient. Hi, everyone. My name is Beth. I go to Westminster Presbyterian just down the road. We have worked on some housing issues with an indigenous community, and I'm sure you've heard about Barbie's Village. Anyway, there was a Presbyterian church that was basically not being used, and so now it's being used by this indigenous nonprofit, and they're going to build tiny houses in the parking lot. So it's a vision that's coming around, and I'm sure lots of people have heard of it. So to answer the question about, what our ideas are, there are a lot of empty churches around. I know there's a lot of red tape that goes along with it, but to me, that's one avenue we could pursue a little bit more systematically.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Sorry, can I just say something to that effect? Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon has worked very closely with Levin community, and I know some of you have worked with Levin. I think Maria Waters and I were just talking about it now. We have advocated to get grants for pre-development costs for churches so that they could look at developing low-income housing. So we are working on that. And it just breaks my heart. I know how important sports are, and Mark and I were just talking about that, but we just saw a short session that passed millions of dollars for a baseball stadium. And I love baseball, but so many other things went underfunded, including this effort to look at how to best utilize church lands when we quote-unquote have an emergency. So we hear you, we're fighting for that. We need to get more active to make that case to our politicians.
Thank you.
My name is Joanne Sims, and I represent the McMinnville Refugee Coalition. And we have recently, through Church World Service, agreed to sponsor a Ukrainian family through the Humanitarian Parole Program. They arrived last August, and so we are now in the process of coming into our first full year of sponsoring this family. And I was wondering if you could give us some ideas or some hints or some guidance as what might we expect in this second year that we have promised to sponsor this family? They only have 2 years. And so we were just kind of wondering what to anticipate and what might our roles become. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question and for your sponsoring of a refugee family. You know, it's interesting. When I talk to our local offices and talk to them about how they support refugees, you know, every family and every situation is different. And some refugee families are able to become self-sufficient, self-reliant very quickly. Sometimes there's other members of the community from where they came from. They connect into that community. Some groups have a lot more difficulty, and you know, when I talk to some of my staff, they're like, "Well, folks, you know, we are not providing services for them anymore, but they still come in, and we still help them." And so it's really, I would just say it's really hard to say. I mean, I would hope in year 2 that you're able to, and if I heard the question right, what to expect with that, the people you're working with is that they will become more settled, more integrated into the community, and hopefully they'll find other people who they can relate to, who speaks their language. You find that very often that you, especially if frankly, I was in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and there's a very kind of vibrant, there's a mosque there and a Muslim community, and people from different countries who all were Muslims found each other and had a place to gather. So I hope that's really what happens over the second year.
So I don't know if I have a question, but I have like a lot of thoughts as I've come here. My name is Maria Paz, and I'm a community school manager here at Portland, Oregon. I work for a local nonprofit called Latino Network, but my position is based at an elementary school. And so I provide a lot of different services for families. After school programming, access to food, and then connect them to like different resources like rent assistance and things like that. And I work for a school that is a dual immersion school, and so it's English and Spanish. And over the last 2 years, bueno, let's say we've seen a lot of changes, right, in the population. So like it's a community that traditionally have been from like a lot of immigrants. But then, you know, we've also seen some gentrification in the neighborhood. And so, like, we saw a decline in population in the studio, in the school. Like, a lot of students had to leave because they couldn't afford housing in the neighborhood anymore. And then in the last year or two, we've been starting to see a lot of families come in, immigrants and refugees, a lot of people from Venezuela. And especially this year, we've seen that a lot, where it's like, they'll be here for a brief period of time, and then they'll leave, you know, just as they're getting settled in the school. And it's kind of like leaves us in a place where it's like, well, what can I do? What should I do? What's my role in this position? I was just talking to a teacher earlier this week, and she was having a meeting with the principal, and she was like, well, while you're here, can I ask both of you something? And I was like, sure. And she's like, what are we gonna do about the refugees? And I was like, I don't know. I was like, I'm trying to, you know, put another fire downstairs, you know, out. And so then Frank sent me the invitation, and I was like, well, I should learn some things, you know, and like maybe keep thinking about like how to help my own community. And I just wanted to share that, and anything you can offer me would be great.
Well, thank you for sharing. I mean, it feels like what you're talking about is asylees coming in from, and yeah, I think it's a challenge for those groups. I mean, usually when they come over, they're released. If they are, oftentimes the way the system works is that they're given a date for which they have to then report, and then their case can be adjudicated. But often, because the courts are so backed up, that those dates, are farther and farther in the future. And so actually part of what the border bill was going to do was create a much more streamlined, more judges, more people who are able to actually help them. And I think, when the refugees come, it's a different process, as you could see. It was really a very involved and vetted, and they come in and then there's support. And folks who asylees are coming over the border don't have that same level of support. And so, one of the things I was hoping the border bill would do, it also be able to provide some support for these groups. So we do case management with children who are unaccompanied, but there is no kind of nationwide case management system for everyone who comes and applies for asylum. So thank you for doing what you do.
Underscore that this is being live streamed, and we have people view from all over the world.
Yeah.
And so just know after we're done, if you have people who want to see this workshop, they can go back to our webpage and you'll see the icon. Just click this on, and it can be watched for years to come. So this is really, really important.
Hi, I'm Audrey from First Christian Church. And over the last couple years, I've seen Church World Service updates about your presence helping with the people being forced out of Ukraine.
Yeah.
So I know that you're on the ground there. Newer conflict in Israel and so on.
Yeah.
What's Church World Service's presence there, if any?
In Gaza. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for decades, we were working with a local partner called the Middle East Council of Churches, and they had a program that worked with refugees in the West Bank and in Gaza. But those relationships have changed a lot, and frankly, we are not on the ground. Frankly, not many organizations are at this point in time. We've been, as Church World Service, just on that specific issue. We've been in a coalition. There's a group called the Center for Middle East Peace that is essentially a coalition of church organizations that we're a part of. And we've been calling for a comprehensive ceasefire because we feel, and frankly, I've been in refugee situations. I mentioned South Sudan. When South Sudan was experiencing a direct civil war, we wanted to send people in, but we couldn't. You can't. It's almost impossible. We have something called duty of care to our staff, and we can't, in good conscience, send people into a war zone, not knowing that we would be able to provide them safety. So it's a really difficult situation there, but it's got to start with a comprehensive ceasefire.
My name is Pat Rummer, and I'm a member of Ainsworth United Church of Christ, and my friend Linda Jaramillo and I serve on the UCC National Collaborative for Immigrant Justice with Noel Anderson, who is a Church World Service person in Washington, D.C. Yeah. My question really is, in some ways, to Frank as well as to you. I work almost essentially only with asylum seekers as a volunteer. And there is no network of support.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful that you're doing it with the unaccompanied minors. But I see and the lack of housing is tremendous. But what I really think, there's a lot of groups locally that have sprung up who are addressing in different ways the needs of asylum seekers. What we lack in Oregon is a coordinating place. Yeah. And whether that's something Church World Service or EMO and SOAR want to take on, but it is a desperate need for there not to be 20 different competing groups dealing with different aspects, but some way that we work together in a collaborative way. So I guess that's my question to you, is nationally how you see doing some of that work as well as locally.
Yeah. I mean, we do have, there's a lot of groups, coalitions and networks that work with refugees. that their mandate has expanded to try to advocate for the folks, asylees coming over the border. It's a difficult challenge because much of our funding, frankly, comes from federal sources, and we do go to foundations and other private sources to try to receive funding, but I would say at this point it's a huge challenge, and you've identified essentially that issue well.
I would say here in the state of Oregon, we've had the ability to have some coordination through the state. In fact, there's been a recent bill that passed which is going to bring some funding towards that. The issue is, it comes down to there is no money. And again, I criticize the difficulty that I have internally when I see some things funded and other things not funded. And so, are there coalitions? Yes, there are coalitions of organizations that get together to talk about this. We've got Emerge, we've got Catholic, Lutheran, we've got so many great organizations that we work in partnership with. We also try to share resources. Sometimes it's, do you know someone that can house somebody? Do you have an extra home? Do you know apartment owners that are willing to maybe rent out for 1 month, and we can bring in people within that month? I'll be honest with you, with the recent homelessness crisis and drugs on the street, more people are afraid to open up their homes, even if it's an ADU. So we've had some churches that have been great, where they've had an extra house on their parsonage, and they've opened the house up for an asylum seeker. We have tiny homes that do not discriminate as to who they're taking in, and that's great to see. And I give mad props to the Methodist Church for being one of the leaders in that space. So I think there is some will to do that. It's just very difficult now because, again, there is a lack of, not desire, but there is a lack of funding.
So thanks, Frank. That was really helpful. There's something that Frank said reminded me that one of the things that we did at Church World Service is create a hotline. And there are some resources around that. So when people come over the border, they're given the number. So one of the ways that we can coordinate, or at least try to begin to help people, is through that hotline number. And frankly, that was funded for the most part through the Methodist Church, through the UMCOR. When that funding runs out, I'm not sure how we're going to continue to support that work. But so there are some mechanisms, especially when you come over the border. So also the other piece is a lot of the resources, at least right now, go to, or a tremendous amount of resources, I say, go to border shelters. So a lot of those are federally funded, so people come over the border, they're detained, they're put into shelters, and then actually they often call it a quote-unquote a second border, because even though you see a lot on the TV of the governor of Texas and the governor of Florida talking about the situation, actually once they've gotten through the process, oftentimes most people move to other places. So, I'll leave it at that.
We have 2 questions, one here and one here. And back there. Okay, those 3. And then Marilyn Keller is going to be here to sing, close this out. And Marilyn Keller was a chief petitioner for Measure 114, the gun initiative. Marilyn. And then Linda Jaramillo, Reverend Jaramillo, will be happy to give a benediction, and Frank, you'll have the closing. How's that?
I'm Dick Nystrom, and I'm with West Hills Covenant Church. Could you say something about the importance of language services? Because it seems like for the families, that's one of the big hurdles.
I mean, I think that one of the things that we, as Church World Service, has a certain amount of language support, and it is a huge thing. We do language orientation when people come, as well as language support when they get here. Having worked with ESL in a different part of my life, the kids figure it out like really quickly. The older you are, the more difficult it seems to be. And I think that's an area that's probably still needs more support, because some of the, though I have to say that when groups come and they find their community, they usually they figure out a way to connect to that community and at least address some of the language services.
Good evening. I'm Steve Agaloo from Augustana Church, and I want to see a show of hands of who could get into their family doctor next week. I'm actually a family physician myself, and my first appointment is July 1st. So what are you doing about medical care access? Is it working through, are you able to access through, the public assistance, some of the other public programs and so forth for providing medical care for the people coming to this country?
Yeah, so I would say, and I'd actually turn it over to Frank to talk about what here, how it's done here in Portland. Every place is different, and that's part of the joy of the U.S. medical system. But one of the experiences that I've had, again, I was in Lancaster visiting that office, and we were able actually to see. We talked to a nurse, and she was giving us kind of how they do it in Lancaster. And so they have a unit that's literally, they have somebody who is available, and they help them do the intake, do the insurance, have a checkup. They also, I don't know if you remember in that thing, so they actually have several medical, if you're a refugee coming to the U.S., they have several medical exams actually before they actually come to the country. So the initial medical screening is done through actually overseas with IOM, and then when they get here, we try to enroll them and try to connect them to the local medical system.
Just real quick, I'm going to pick on Vesna, who's our Director for Refugee Resettlement here. Vesna, can you give an idea of medical services when a refugee comes in?
Okay, so all refugees, before they come to the United States, they have a medical, statement coming with them. So we know what's going on. Do they need immediate attention, or they are just okay? So they are all eligible for OHP. So they are immediately going to be screened at Refugee Clinic, which is Mid-County Clinic on Southeast. And from there, they will have a primary care physician and all other, appointments if they need them. And kids also will have immunization before they start the school.
Yeah.
So they are covered, and they are taken care of that.
And I'll say part of it is the relationship that we have with the county that allows us to be able to streamline a lot of our refugees. Vesna had one person come in during the snowstorm. Was it a baby, right, that had a heart condition? Yes. And so, without getting too many details, that person had to be rushed. We really had to spend one night at the airport because they couldn't get out to the snowstorm, and they had to be rushed to be seen immediately by hospital. So we know how they're coming in, and then we've got a great working relationship with the county to be able to get those services. But yes, it's not next day normal.
Speaking of the county, J.R. Lilly, he, him, his, Director of the Office of Community Involvement for Multnomah County. Wonderful conversation, great information. Thank you for sharing this. I'm going to be referring your video to a lot of community members who are interested in this topic. So, yes. And if you're interested more in learning more about what we're doing with local asylum seekers, just community organizations getting together on Sunday, I'll send the info out. But if you want more, asylumsolidaritypdx@gmail.com. Asylumsolidaritypdx@gmail.com. So as a government employee, we're trying to figure out how do we help asylum seekers when they're first coming in. The problem we're running into is that because they don't have the same status as refugees or there's limited services, and trying to get them into our current housing system, which we're already is overflowing, is getting because they don't have work status, they can't prove that they're not ready to move in ready to get into services. So that's a barrier for us. Do you have any ideas for strategies or suggestions, or see how other folks might be helping this out?
think that was our last question. Oh, okay, we'll do one more. Go ahead, please. Oh, sorry, response to JR? Sorry, JR, maybe I didn't hear the question.
I was like,
Okay.
yeah, what is the,
Okay,
I didn't hear the question either. What was the question specifically?
Strategies of which local government should be doing to help asylum seekers.
So local government, again, every place is different. I think the challenge is, as you said, okay, so one is the work permit. Absolutely, that's it. That oftentimes when they come in, they don't have a work permit or the ability to work immediately. You know, the ability to create a case management system, frankly, that we have a case management system for refugees. We're really clear about all the different things that they need, and you know, whether that's federal or local, but some ability to track when they come in, what their needs are, and how to best serve those needs. Sometimes, you know, what they need actually most might be legal services immediately, right? Sometimes there's psychosocial services that are needed, health. You know, the challenge is with a national refugee system, there actually is a case, we are able to manage those cases much more closely. What we're doing with the unaccompanied minors is exactly that. So we're trying to create a national case management system for them. So when they come in, we're able to know who they are, know where they're going, find out what services they've already accessed, and then what services they need. So frankly, it's probably not even, I mean, I would say it's not a local issue, it's probably a more national issue, and it would probably be best addressed if we had a national case management system for asylum seekers.
Andy, we want to recognize two members of Augustana who've been running the sound and live stream, Ben Joy and Andy Fort. And Andy was also the pianist earlier. One more question. Frank, I would suggest this, that you give closing remarks along with Rick right after this, and Marilyn Keller sing us, and then Reverend Linda Jaramillo, past president, give us the benediction at the end, or either way you want to do that. But and I have to say too, Rick, it's so good to see you again. Thank you for all you do on behalf of us in partnership. And we are so lucky to have Frank So here. Everybody I mentioned back in DC, he already knows. So we are so lucky to have you as the executive director and president of Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon. Please, last question of the night.
Excuse me, and it's both a question and a comment. I want to thank you very much for this. I learned so much, and I have been part of an NGO that my husband and I started that supports a shelter in Mexico, people that are trying to get to the border, but many can't make it. Most of the people we help are amputees who fall from trains and lose legs and arms. They're young people, mostly young boys it started. Now we have more and more women. So I want to thank you, though, for sharing with me what Church World Services does, because one of the things I know you do is to support our shelter. And I know I spoke with you earlier about that, Frank, and that is really a big help. And the only other little thing I want to say, and I appreciate the chance to have this opportunity to advertise an event that my husband and I are supporting on the 13th of April at Tabor Space. It is a film called Where Can We Live in Peace? And that's what we're talking about tonight. The refugees, the migrants are asking, where can we live in peace? And this is a Canadian filmmaker who's made this film. And so I'm kind of pushing the envelope a little just to advertise that, but I know the people here all share the same concern that we do. And our NGO is called Latin American Relief Fund. So I hope you will all come. We have some little flyers we can give out. And I'm so impressed with the work that I had no idea the expanse of the work you're doing. And I just want to thank you very, very much.
Great. Thank you so much.
And Frank, would you remind
I'm going to say my last comments will be not about refugees, but about the Crop Hunger Walk. It's another joint ministry we do with ecumenical ministries. We support the Northeast, I want to make sure I get this, emergency food program, but on at 2 p.m. on April 28th, starting at First Christian Church, we are going to have the Portland area crop hunger walk. There's leaflets on the tables in the back. There's a QR code, so please support the good work of the Crop Hunger Walk is that we support local food banks as well as hunger globally. Frank, thank you.
Big round of applause for Rick Santos. Thank you, Rick. Thank you. Just a couple of closing remarks. I was just told about, if you haven't heard of this website, letasylumseekerswork.org. It's a petition to try to get workers, asylum seekers to be able to get work permits. I'd encourage you to look at that. Nasia, could you raise your hand? Nasia knows more about that. If you have questions, I'm going to put her on the spot. Would also like to recognize, I know I've called out Vesna, who's our refugee resettlement director. I would also like to call out Caroline, who's director for our refugee legal services. Caroline, could you put your hand up? Yes, okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Very pleased to have J.R. Lilly here from the county. It's important when we have these type of discussions that we invite our electeds. We have folks that are running for office that are in this room. It's important for them to hear the why this is important, not just to say, well, we need policies. Well, this is why we need the policies. I would also say, you know, people have been asking, well, what can I do? So I think back to what Rick and Mark have been doing for decades. Get involved. As you come in, you will notice that there's ways to sign up for our newsletters. Get involved. If you're interested in advocacy, which is a way to have substantial change, get involved. John Calhoun is here. He sits on our policy committee. I'll put him on the spot too. Join us. Learn about our programs. Help us be better. We do need houses. We do need housing. If you know someone with space, please let us know. We would also ask if you have financial ability to contribute, please do so as well. And there's events, there's films. We support all those things. There's enough to go around everywhere. And so we want to make that the case, that it's not just about emo, it's not just about the crop walk, it's not just about a film. It's how we support each other as a holistic, comprehensive way to support the values that we have. I will say this much too, you know, for me, this is an important issue. I'm a son of 2 immigrants to the United States. Most of us can trace our roots back to an immigration. Most of us can in this country. I'm also very pleased to be able to host a family, a refugee family, in the coming months. And I live by myself, so I can do that in a house. I would encourage you to look at what can you do, because you can do something. And for those of you that are already hosting in the Baptist Church, thank you very much. West Hills Covenant, who's given up that house. Thank you. Augustana, that's doing this work tirelessly. Thank you. So I'm going to end there. I'm going to continue to ask for your support in any way that you can. We're going to be here right after. If you've got questions, please come see us. This energy in the room, this is where the magic is, right? And someone said to me once, "Oh, Frank, I'm retired. I don't know what I can do." And I said, one of the most beautiful things about being retired is that you're not worried anymore about, if I say something that I really feel, will I not get the job? As a 501c3, we can't be political, but I'm going to tell you to go vote. But as a retired person, and someone told me, he said, you know what, Frank, you're right. I can speak up for what I believe is right. So, people say, oh, I'm retired, I don't know if there's anything I can do. You can do a lot. You can speak up. You can have those awkward conversations at the dinner table. It's your job. Do it. Do it, because this is the legacy that will outlast our lives. So, thank you very much. I'm going to leave it to Linda to give us a closing benediction. Oh, Marilyn first. Okay, Marilyn, please. No need to fight. Marilyn, please. Thank you.
I bring you greetings. Thank you for having me be a part of this. My name is Marilyn Keller, and I'm a member here at Augustana Lutheran Church in good standing. I am part of the Augustana Jazz Quartet, which has been presenting a jazz gospel worship service here for the past 33 years. I've chosen a song by Pete Seeger for tonight. My father's mansion's many rooms have room for all of his children, as long as we do share his love and see that all are free, and see that all are free to grow, and see that all are free to know, and free to open or to close the door of their own room. What is a room without a door, which sometimes locks or stands ajar? What is a room without a wall, to keep out sight and sound from all? And dwellers in each room should have the right to choose their own design and color schemes to suit their own, though differing from mine. Yes, and its door has its own design to suit the owner's state of mind, and those who'd want them all the same don't understand the human game. The choice is ours to share this earth with all its many joys abound, or to continue as we have and burn God's mansion down. My father's mansion's many rooms have room for all of his children, if we do but share in his love and see that all are free. Pastora.
There's a bump right here. Yeah. Before I pray, I want to just say a couple of things. When I come out to events like this, it's just so inspiring to see where our soul lives. And in these times when I had the honor and privilege of being on the Ecumenical Ministries of Oregon board, and many years ago, one of the things that we adopted at EMO was love first. And then just a couple of years later, we turned it into love in action. And in our times, I'm praying for 2024. And I'm praying that we can transform hostility to hospitality, and that we can transform woundedness to sacredness. So let's pray. Dios en nuestras vidas y nuestros corazones. Aquí estamos juntos. Te damos gracias por la oportunidad de estar aquí juntos y juntas y juntes. Te damos gracias por todo el poder que nos das. Holy One of so many names, we give you thanks. We give you thanks for bringing us here in this space and making this circle wider for all those who we touch on the way out of here. We give you thanks for the strength that you give us day to day, hour to hour. We need you now, dear God, of so many names. Now bless each person here. We ask for your guidance and safety as we return to those places where we reside, and pray for all of those who have no place to go. En todos los nombres que nos das, in all of your many names, let us all say, Amen.
Mark your house.
May you go in peace and serve the Creator. And share the peace with one another as you come up to talk or go out. And to our speaker tonight, it's only midnight back in Washington, D.C. He's going strong, so come up and talk some more. He races up the country back and forth.